When it comes to remakes, Pokémon has definitely had its highs and lows. Games like Heart Gold Soul Silver and Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire are regarded as some of the best in the entire series, while the most recent remakes Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are widely considered some of the lowest effort games the franchise has ever produced. Which brings us to the Black and White remakes. It feels inevitable that the Unova region will eventually make the jump to 3D, and that certainly makes one wonder which route Game Freak would take. My goal with this video isn't to convince you that the Black and White remakes will be announced on the upcoming Pokémon Day, or that they're even the next games to be released, but it's hard to deny that they will happen eventually. So today I want to dive into what I think those Black and White remakes should be, from gameplay to art style and graphics, and which features should and maybe shouldn't return from the originals. So everyone bring your best wishes to mind, don't forget to hit that like button, and let's begin with what's gotta be the biggest worry on people's minds, the graphics. It's been nearly 14 years since Pokemon fans first ventured to the Unova region, and that's wild to me cause I was still in high school when these games came out. And I still remember the trailer making quite a splash when it showed off Castelia City, the first major step towards Pokemon shifting to the third dimension. But the battle still remained confidently cemented in 2D, featuring spectacularly animated sprites that were considered peak back then and continue to look clean as hell to this day. Some fans even argue Game Freak should have stuck with the pixelated aesthetic they seem to be dominating during this era. And I previously made a video discussing whether Pokemon games should have stayed 2D, but the fact is, they did not. Fast forward to now and we have Gen 9, which despite its visual shortcomings has made a lot of improvements to the Pokemon and characters themselves. But of course, this isn't the only example of what Pokemon can look like in 3D.
Experience the brilliance once more. What the fuck?
It's hard to argue that despite the overworld's sometimes underwhelming appearance, most fans would probably choose the Sword and Shield or Scarlet and Violet art style over the chibi remakes. I honestly feel bad for the dozens of Brilliant Diamond and Pearl fans because they probably never hear the end of it, but come on, how can anyone take this serious? Black and White are often described as having the best story in the entire series. At the very least, they managed to evoke the most emotions. I mean, this is where the infamous Pokemon sad music comes from after all. So when it comes to the remakes, I pray they go with a more realistic style, because I just can't imagine some of these cutscenes having the same emotional weight if the characters looked like they came out of MapleStory. Beyond just the chibis though, the Gen 4 remakes didn't get very creative when it comes to updating the cities and routes of Sinnoh either. They were marketed as faithful remakes after all, which resulted in pretty much a one-to-one recreation of the overworld that sometimes managed to look worse than the original somehow. I started this segment by mentioning how cool Castelia City looked back when it was first revealed, but I'll admit the test of time hasn't been kind to this city's visuals, and it would probably look pretty underwhelming if it were just faithfully remade, as opposed to being rebuilt from the ground up to more closely resemble something like Illumio City from Pokemon X and Y, or perhaps more like Levincia with its brilliant skyscrapers and shining lights. The Hoenn remakes did something quite interesting with its main city of Mauville, converting it from a fairly rural-looking town into a sprawling indoor mall. It was certainly a weird change, but I appreciate the effort to make it stand out. And since we're talking about Hoenn, I just want to say that this was personally my favorite look for the overworld characters in 3D Pokemon games. So if the Black and White remakes still want to go with this more faithful approach, I will gladly take this style over whatever they were cooking with Brilliant Diamond and Pearl. While visuals certainly feel like the most talked about aspect of the potential Black and White remakes, I would argue there's another discussion far more crucial to the outcome of these games. So next, I want to dive into the possibility of Unova evolving from Pokemon's traditional route-based regions into Game Freak's new favorite concept, an open world. Ever since coming to the Nintendo Switch, Pokemon has slowly been transforming into an open world experience. You can definitely argue whether this has been good or bad for the series, and that's definitely a topic for a future video, but regardless, history shows that since the introduction of the wild area in Sword and Shield, every game since has tried to build upon that open area concept. Legends Arceus introduced a lot more ways to interact with the environment, and of course multiple ride Pokemon to help you actually traverse the world in different ways. Heck, even Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl heavily expanded the underground to feature Pokemon appearing in the overworld as opposed to hiding in the grass. And then we get to Scarlet and Violet, which of course featured Pokemon's first official open world. At least according to the marketing, this was the first time they actually labeled it as such. And it was a seamlessly connected sandbox as opposed to the multiple open zones found in Legends Arceus. Again, you could argue which game was more fun to explore, but the fact Game Freak seems committed to improving the open world and seemingly abandoning the old route system makes me curious if the Black and White remakes might actually choose to reconstruct the Unova region entirely to make it play more like Scarlet and Violet. Sounds like a tall task, and based on recent releases, I would lean more towards Game Freak just simplifying the region, but at the very least I wonder if they might incorporate Pokemon roaming outside the grass if it's a one-to-one remake like still with routes, cause that definitely made the world feel more alive in Sword and Shield. The last 4 games have featured at least some elements of open world games, so is it really that crazy to think the Black and White remakes wouldn't at least try? I would personally love to see another hybrid like Sword and Shield, with some traditional routes featuring more trainers and overworld Pokemon, but also a few more open areas like the Desert Resort definitely comes to mind as a route that could easily be converted into a wild area-esque zone. Even more straightforward areas like Pinwheel Forest and Undella Bay could be reworked to look more like the Heartwood or Cobalt Coast from Pokemon Legends Arceus. I mean, if you think about it, Chargestone Cave from Black and White was basically transformed into a non-linear cave system in the Indigo Disc DLC, so maybe that was a hint of what's to come in the future. I firmly believe there will at least be some incorporation of open world elements in the remakes, but I'm curious what you guys think. Could Unova work as an open world like that found in Scarlet and Violet, or would you rather see a hybrid like the Galar region of Sword and Shield? Almost everything I've brought up so far has been heavily leaning towards the realm of speculation, but I want to shift gears now and talk about some things that are all but guaranteed to return in the Black and White remakes. So let's get into some of these returning features. Remember when I mentioned there might be some features you probably don't remember even being in the Unova games? Well, Pokémon Dream World was an online browser game that let you send a Pokémon into the World Wide Web. There was a little house you could customize, a garden that let you grow berries, which you couldn't do anywhere else in Unova apparently, and different areas where you could encounter Pokemon from prior generations, which in Pokemon Black and White at least, you couldn't catch pre-post game. The idea was pretty neat and came at a time when the internet was just starting to become part of everyday life, so it definitely made sense then, but nowadays, I don't really see it coming back, at least not as a browser game, but hear me out. With a name like Dream World, this might just be the greatest opportunity to tie in everyone's favorite spin-off, Pokemon Sleep, baby! As much as people memed on this game before it released, I feel like it's become a pretty popular niche. I haven't played much of it myself, but I always see people tweeting about the silly Pokemon and shinies they find, and as of now, I don't think there's any way to transfer Pokemon caught in sleep to any other game, so this feels like it'd be the perfect fit. Game Freak could even play it off like this was their master plan all along, and Pokemon Sleep was yet another hint that Unova remakes were always coming. Or maybe I'm just crazy, but back in the originals, Pokemon you met in the Dream World browser game could then be transferred to the DS games and caught in an area called Entry Forest, which is part of a larger, potentially returning feature known as the Entralink. The name sounds a lot cooler than what it actually is. Basically just a mystical clearing supposedly located in the middle of Unova. Inside the Entralink, you could find the aforementioned Entry Forest and catch Pokemon transferred from the Dream World. But that's not all the Entralink was good for, as you could also visit other players' worlds or have friends visit yours and complete missions together. I never got to use this feature myself because I think my Wi-Fi was pretty crap back then, but now that connecting online with friends is much easier to do, I feel like the whole Entralink could probably just be replaced with the Union Circle. But another option could be to copy what the Sinnoh remakes did with the Grand Underground and pretty much transform the Entralink into an entirely new area where you can interact with friends and catch Pokemon not normally found in Unova. However, I would much prefer if they transformed Unova into a semi-open world, like I said, and then this whole concept could instead be more like the Blueberry quests, which were admittedly pretty fun to do with friends. Another feature that absolutely has to return are seasons. This is another one of those mechanics I think a lot of people forget existed, but it was one that made Gen 5 stand out as the first and only generation to feature spring, summer, fall, and winter. Rather than waiting months like the real world though, seasons in Unova would cycle every month, so you'd get to experience all 4 seasons 3 times a year. And not only would this affect the kinds of Pokemon that spawn, but the entire map would have subtle differences in routes and cities, like snowy mounds melting in the summer, and even changing the background music on certain routes, which was a really nice touch, and always made it a surprising pleasure to open up the games after not playing for a while. Another feature that's likely to return are triple and rotation battles. Like the last few I've mentioned, I feel a lot of fans forget these, and I don't blame them since there were only a handful of them in their debut games, and really not many more in the sequels. Triple and rotation battles did make a brief reappearance in Gen 6, I think exclusively in the Battle Maison, but I don't know, I think they were pretty unique, especially rotation battles since you can switch and attack on the same turn, which made the mind games of predicting what your opponent might rotate into that much crazier. Simply because they first appeared in Black and White though, I think these wacky battle modes have to return for at least one last bout in the remakes. But one feature I'm not as eager to see come back from the dead are Pokemon musicals. Almost every main series game features some kind of side activity to give players an alternative to battling. Most often it's been Pokemon contests, which at least in the older games had a little bit of strategy involved with getting to choose what moves your Pokemon use. But as usual, the Sinnoh remakes chose to scrap this and turn contests into one of the most bare bones rhythm games I think I've ever played. And trust me, I've played a lot of them. Considering in Black and White contests were also replaced with Pokemon musicals of all things, I think it's pretty likely that this rhythm game is coming back. And unless they make significant improvements to make it, actually fun, I'm willing to bet 90% of players will maybe try it once and never touch it again. Why can't they just bring back the Pokeathlon, man? To wrap up this segment, I want to talk about a feature that still confuses me to this day. So bear with me as I try to explain the version-exclusive areas known as Black City and White Forest. So, in Pokemon Black and Black 2, you can find Black City, a futuristic-looking modern marvel of technology with neon skyscrapers that's home to many tough trainer battles and a market where you can purchase rare items. In Pokemon White and White 2, you'll instead find White Forest, a tranquil forestscape where nature prevails and thus is home to many wild Pokemon. The trainers in Black City use the fully evolved forms of the same Pokemon you can catch in the wild in White Forest. And by visiting a friend with the opposite version through the Entra link, you can get either that Pokemon or trainer or item to appear in your game. Sound complicated? Well, apparently Pokemon thought so too, cause in the sequels they completely scrapped all of this Entralink nonsense and pretty much turned Black City and White Forest into battle facilities. If you manage to make it halfway through, you unlock a key that you can transfer to the opposite version and unlock that opposite version's facility. So like, you can get the White Tree Hollow in black or the Black Tower in white. So when it comes to the remakes, I think it's a no-brainer which version they should bring back. But more than anything, I feel like these areas would be the perfect opportunity to bring back some beloved Pokemon forms lost in time. That's right, it's the return of Paradox Pokemon. Had you fooled there for a moment, didn't I? These areas are an ideal fit to bring back paradoxes with their nature versus technology themes. It might not seem that likely in faithful remakes, but keep in mind before Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, it was actually normal for remakes to include some features from that generation's main games. Like we got new Mega Evolutions in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, so I think it's at least plausible they'll add more paradoxes in the remakes, especially with how popular some of them have become. So if the remakes actually get announced next, I'll probably do a follow-up video on which Paradox Pokemon I would most want to see, or just which ones I think would fit Unova the most. To wrap up this video, I want to talk about one last factor that might just make or break how people feel about these remakes, and that is the Unova region Pokédex. A recurring criticism I hear for the original Black and White is the decision to only include new Pokemon from the Unova region. A lot of folks claim Gen 5 was meant to be a sort of reboot for the series, which is why they chose to only feature new Pokemon before post-game, and likely why a lot of the creature designs felt like revamped versions of Gen 1 Pokemon. You could argue this was a good way to promote the new creatures, but in Black and White 2, they went back on this decision by including older Pokemon from the start, so it's kinda hard to guess whether or not they would do this in the remakes, but at least history shows that all the previous remakes have featured an almost identical Pokédex to their original versions, with the only exceptions being ones which evolved from or into Pokemon from that region. Now, the only Gen 5 Pokemon to have a cross-regional evolution is Kingambit. I think that's literally it. I mean, there's a bunch of Hisuian forms like Lilligant, Braviary, Basculegion, and I guess there's Runerigus, but I don't think it would make sense for any of them to be found in Unova. In the end, I think this choice to lock non-Unovan Pokemon until post-game left a negative mark on the original Black and White, since nowadays it seems most people prefer to play the sequels, and I think that's in large part due to the wider variety of Pokemon available. So I have a strong feeling they won't make that mistake again and include more than just Unovan Pokemon in the base remakes. Whether they're in the actual routes or in some kind of new area like the Underground from Brilliant Diamond and Pearl. Heck, they could even bring back Hidden Grottos from the sequels. But like I mentioned, that just depends on how they handle Black and White 2 content in general, cause if these end up being faithful remakes again, then I'm not too hopeful. Ultimately, it feels like the fate of these remakes will depend on whether Pokemon can stop and realize fans are okay waiting for good quality games. I used to think it was so silly how Call of Duty would constantly chug out the same game year after year, and it's sad to see that my favorite franchise has essentially become the same thing. But I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts. Let me know in the comments below what your ideal Black and White remakes would look like, and don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed the video. Pokemon Day is coming up very soon on February 27th, and it's confirmed there will be a Pokemon Presents happening, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned as I will be streaming my live reaction to that right here on YouTube. And until then, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.